Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1121 reignites the race for the One Piece as we head further into the final saga, and in this breakdown, I'll be talking about all of the potential races that have been lost to history, the fate of Saturn and the extent of his regeneration, of course all the cameos around the world, and much more. So if you end up enjoying this video or any of the other videos on my channel, be sure to like and subscribe. With that said, let's get into Chapter 1121, the upheaval of the era. While not maintained in the English translation, this chapter's original title actually comes from a quote from Gold Roger as seen on the first page of chapter 100, The Ebb and Flow of the Ages. The whole quote is, "These things cannot be stopped, an inherited strength of will, one's dreams, the ebb and flow of the ages. As long as people hunger for freedom, these things will exist." The significance of this quote has echoed throughout the series and has become much more poignant in recent years, especially with this chapter, and we'll get more into that later in the video. While this chapter starts off with the continuation of Saturn's assault on the giant ship, I'd like to first talk about my favorite part of these past few chapters, the return of characters from around the world that we haven't seen in a while. We first check in on Loketown, where we see a visual transponder snail has been set up in front of the execution platform. You can spot it underneath the screen and make out the same building behind the platform as we first saw over 1,000 chapters ago. Then, as Vegapunk talks about the ancient weapons, we fittingly check in on Vivi and Shirahoshi. We've seen Vivi throughout this arc reacting to both the Straw Hat's activities on Egghead and the message, but we last saw Shirahoshi a few chapters ago, tuned into the broadcast. From there, we revisit Skypiea for the first time in over a decade. We last saw these characters during the Decks of the World cover story, back during the Fishman Island arc. Up front, we have Konis, who was working alongside Rocky at the Pumpkin Cafe. Beside her is Isa and Nola, who we had last seen working at the Rubber Band Land amusement park. In the background are the four Shandian warriors who became God's guardians, Brahm, Genbo, Wiper, and Kamakiri. Great to see these characters once again after all this time, and of note, it doesn't seem like they're listening to or are aware of Vegapunk's broadcast here, as we hadn't really seen transponder snail technology up on this Sky Island. As Vegapunk talks about the persecution of people around the world that are different from typical humans, we check in on a few of the characters that we have seen in the series that are special tribes. Marco is shown tuning into the broadcast alongside a couple of the residents of Sphinx that we had seen before. He is of course a regular human as far as we know, but he reminisces on a conversation that he had with Whitebeard, who had mentioned a land of gods atop the Red Line. This exchange was actually first shown to us readers back during the Wano arc after Marco witnessed the Lunarian, Albert, better known as King. Marco having remained on Sphinx is also a bit interesting, as we had last seen him during the previous day when Buchan explained Weevil's abduction by the Marines. Many had speculated that Buchan and Marco may be headed toward Egghead, as she mentioned that Vegapunk could prove Weevil's connection to Whitebeard. However, it seems that this is not the case, for Marco at least, as Buchan herself is not present in this panel. Perhaps she had left for Egghead alone during the previous day, which would prove pretty interesting now that her clone Stussy is left without a place to go. Maybe we could see something there with the two of them teaming up. One last thing of note is the transponder snail we see Marco using seems to have maintained Whitebeard's appearance after all of these years since his death, which is pretty adorable. Though I do wonder if it's possible that the snail had been used by or to communicate with Weevil and that's actually maintaining his appearance. Anyways, we also see the return of King after he was detained by Admiral Ryokugyu at the end of the Wano arc. It's not clear where he is exactly, as Oda has presented him with a pitch black background, much like a few of the other characters have been presented throughout this message. Back then, Ryokugyu had called in a battleship after having apprehended the remains of Kaido's forces, though we never really saw what happened to them after that, since Ryokugyu ended up clashing with the Scabbards and then got interrupted by Shanks, but I would think it to be possible that he took the Animal Kingdom pirates with him when leaving, in which case King may be imprisoned right now, though he does seem to be bandaged up here, so it's hard to say for sure. We know Ryokugyu was also the one to take in Weevil after he was at Wano, so I wonder if King and Weevil could be detained together right now. Either way, King is shown thinking about some dialogue from his past, perhaps the lines spoken by some unnamed Animal Kingdom pirates when they saw King's face for the first time, or at least some variation of that. Someone else who is imprisoned is Pudding, last seen on one of the Blackbeard pirate ships, where she may still be. We had never really known for sure if the Three-Eyed Tribe was extinct or not, or just how rare they are in general, but it's not too surprising if they are considering their ability to read the poneglyphs. Pudding looks to be thinking back to her childhood here, where she was bullied and ridiculed for having her third eye. Now Kuma is also shown here since he was said to be the last of the Buccaneer people, but what's more interesting to me is the specific memory that is included here. This is a scene that we saw during Kuma's flashback when he first met Vegapunk. With Marco, King, and Pudding, all of the dialogue we see with them are presented as memories that they are thinking about, especially with Pudding and King. This makes me wonder if we are to understand this piece of Kuma's flashback as something that he is thinking about himself, instead of just something that we are being shown as readers. As we know, Kuma is not necessarily dead, but instead just in a vegetative state. But despite this, he was able to continue moving and protect Bonney, briefly due to some mysterious ability unique to the Buccaneers that we never really learned more about. I have to wonder if we're on the verge of getting this expounded upon and are getting more subtle hints to Kuma coming back in some capacity, especially with that brief smile that we may have gotten a little bit later on in the chapter. This page, focusing on characters who come from rare lineages, really makes you wonder if there are more people like this out there. The world government has been around for almost 1,000 years. How many more races have gone extinct due to their actions? Perhaps the fishmen were also en route to this type of fate, but somehow were able to maintain their population under the ocean. I wouldn't be surprised if we keep getting more and more races until the end of the story. Moving on a bit, we also checked back in on some folks from Water 7. We had seen Iceberg and Alice toward the very start of this broadcast, and had seen Tilestone earlier in the day beside Iceberg and the gang reacting to their global earthquake. Beside him looks to be who may be Peeply Lulu, given his tattoo and the pointy mustache sticking out behind the text balloon. We had seen him alongside Polly just a few chapters ago. As Vegapunk continues on about his faith in science and reason, we're presented with a few scientists, including Caesar and Judge, who seem to now be arguing once again. Perhaps this was prompted by their mixed feelings for Vegapunk after we had seen them reacting to his death not too long ago. We also get the return of Haredas and a few of the other researchers on Witheria. We last saw these fellows during the Decks of the World cover story after the Zoe arc, where they were shown back at Witheria having updated their fashion sense for Nami, though here it seems that they may be back in their regular wizard-like outfits. There are a few more cameos toward the end of this chapter, but I think it makes a bit more sense to talk about them alongside Vegapunk's message. Now, while the message is playing out, the bulk of the action in this chapter comes from Saturn's assault on the giant pirate ship. The combat starts off with Saturn swarming the giants with his legs as Luffy warns them of their poison capabilities. Fortunately, it seems the giants have been able to fend off against this onslaught with their shields. Now, I know a lot of people have been wondering whatever happened to this ability, as it was never really shown again after it was first introduced, where we saw it disintegrate a tree. Since then, we've seen Saturn make contact with the ground, buildings, and even island clouds, where this destructive poison never really seemed to come into play. Against the Straw Hats, everyone was able to come out unscathed, even Chopper, who made contact with Saturn's legs at several points. From what I can gather, it may just be that Saturn's toxic limbs only affect living things, or else he would be constantly destroying the very ground that he walks on, or the ship that he's currently on. In the case of Chopper, it's certainly possible that Chopper's thick fur prevented Saturn from piercing through to his flesh. Of course, I'm not saying this definitively, but that's just where my head is at this moment to explain this. Luffy begins to wind up his fist, much like we saw during his fight with Saturn earlier in the arc before he delivered a dawn gatling to the Elder, but he also takes notice of Bonney trying to realize her Nika-like future once more. He punches Saturn's legs out of the way, giving her enough time to take this form once again, though Saturn is infuriated at this and calls her just a pale imitation, echoing Mars's reaction to this form in the previous chapter and once again trying to discourage her from her beliefs as he did earlier in the arc. However, Bonney does not waver here as she thinks back to all of the memories she had with Kuma, as well as some of his memories that she saw during the previous day. We get Kuma's first encounter with Saturn back during the Kuma flashback, as well as the scene of her dancing alongside him. She mentions once again how she wanted to die, evoking Kuma's similar thoughts during his childhood and her disposition just earlier in the arc as well. She also thinks back to a bit earlier in the day when she realized all of this pain and suffering in her life was Saturn's personal doing. With this, we get a silhouetted memory of Ginny when Bonney was born. This silhouetted appearance is likely because Oda does not wish to show us her covered up in sapphire scales, just as her appearance was hidden during the flashback. Interestingly, we get a fabricated memory of Kuma and Ginny as well, having raised Bonney together, reconstructing a scene similar to the one that we saw at the start of Kuma's life, with Kuma's parents thanking him for being born, a sentiment echoed by Kuma to Bonney as well. It's almost as if Bonney is thinking back to an alternate past, as opposed to the alternate futures her devil fruit powers allow. With this, we get a combo attack with Bonney and Luffy, a mix of Bonnie's supersized Nika punch that we saw a few chapters ago, and a variant of Luffy's Gum Gum Dawn Gatling, as they both hit Saturn with armament hockey infused fists. For whatever reason, this attack is impactful enough to punch literal holes through Saturn's body. Not only that, we see several of Saturn's limbs having been broken off entirely. This is a bit different from how Saturn was when he took Luffy's Dawn Gatling earlier in this arc, which I suppose just goes to show how powerful this combination is supposed to be. That said, I do think he'll be just fine from this, as he's been shown to have a general weak composition to begin with, as his body was ripped apart after getting punched by Kuma and being buried in rubble, or when Frankie's laser pierced through his torso. In both instances, he was able to regenerate his body without issue, and while he is depicted here with whited out eyes, usually insinuating a knockout, we've seen Saturn with this kind of expression before. What'll be really interesting to see is how he'll handle being knocked into the ocean. There's been a ton of speculation that the Elders may be immune to the effects of seawater on Devil Fruit abilities, since Workery was shown nonchalantly jumping toward the giant ship not too long ago. I've said on the channel before that I would not be surprised at all if the Elders have some means of circumventing potential weaknesses to the sea, or perhaps they don't even have Devil Fruits to begin with. We'll just have to see what happens. Though, one outcome that would be quite interesting is if they are Devil Fruit users and cannot move in the water, but the regeneration is not tied to their fruit abilities at all, meaning they can sink but not die. Sort of like how Jack was able to breathe underwater due to him being a fishman, but was stuck due to him being a Devil Fruit user. Perhaps that'll be the ultimate way to deal with the Elders altogether, by sending them back to the depths of the ocean like the sea devils that they actually are. Either way, I'm excited to see what becomes of Saturn in the coming chapters. It's with this victory that all of the Giants cheer, and we get a quick glimpse at Kuma, who seems to have potentially cracked a bit of a smile. Again, we'll have to see what comes of this in the future. Dory and Brokey also notice a ship falling out of the sky, recognizing it to be Luffy's. I have to wonder if they made this connection based on them seeing the Thousand Sunny and Frankie's bounty poster, which was why they didn't recognize Frankie earlier in the arc. On the ship, we see a terrified Usopp, but the rest of the crew seems fairly calm about this, given that they've been through similar situations throughout the series, most recently having sailed right off the waterfall of Wano. We leave this scene with Zoro noticing something and reaching for his blade, which makes me think that Nusjiro may not be done with the Straw Hats just yet, so we'll have to see what happens next chapter. One last detail before moving on is that we also get to check in on Sentomaru and Kizaru after having not heard from them in about 10 or so chapters. It seems Kizaru is unfortunately still laid out on the ground of the ship, just as he was when we last saw him, though he's no longer covering his face. We do get the answer to what had happened to Sentomaru since he was last taken captive by the Marines earlier in the arc, and I had been wondering if he was just going to be left on the island once the Marines were evacuated for the Buster Call, but given the small details on the background that we can make out, it seems more likely that he's been taken to one of the Marine ships. Now, Vegapunk in this chapter continues his view of the future that he spoke of at the end of the last one, which we learned to essentially be a reaffirmation of everything that we as fans have been speculating for years. All of the truths of the Void Century will come to light when the One Piece is found. Roger started it all 24 years ago when he set fire in the hearts of explorers and pirates alike, and 2 years ago, Whitebeard rekindled that flame by proclaiming that the One Piece was real, moments before his death. And here, Vegapunk essentially does the same once again by adding on to the importance and weight of this pursuit. Vegapunk wonders if Roger's actions before his execution were done with purpose, providing an answer to his rhetorical question that he proposed a few chapters ago, where he asked why the Roger pirates kept the truth to themselves. And so, in the final pages of this chapter, Vegapunk declares that the future of the world rests in the hands of the person who finds the One Piece. And with this, we get an incredible who's who of the quote-unquote contenders in this race for the One Piece. At the top of the billing is of course the four emperors in a composition that is very reminiscent of the color spread that we got back toward the end of Wano. We have Buggy laughing in tears, who we last saw earlier in this arc, as he proclaimed his desire to be a real pirate and find the One Piece, much to his followers' excitement and his co-officers' annoyance. In this chapter, we find the crew members even more infatuated with Buggy's motivation, and Crocodile is also revealed to still be on the island after we saw him with a blacked out background a few chapters ago. We also have Blackbeard, who we last saw a few chapters ago as well, as he was shown intrigued at Vegapunk's mention of the D, though it was not shown where he was located at the time. And this chapter doesn't really help to answer that question either, aside from the revelation that he and his crew have still not returned to Fodaled, presumably since yesterday's events at Winter Island. This actually makes a lot of sense with how Pudding was still shown to be imprisoned on the ship earlier in the chapter. It'll be interesting to see where he's at or where he's headed, with many speculating Wano and others hoping for Elbaf. We'll just have to see. Aside from Luffy, we also have Shanks, who was shown earlier in the arc destroying the Kid Pirates and their ship. It seems they are on the sea once again, which follows given that they were trying to set out to sea just before Kid arrived. It's not clear exactly where the crew is going, but we do know that they've been seeking out Blackbeard, so perhaps we could even get a clash between these two Emperor crews sooner than we think. One of the crewmates calls out Shanks for overdrinking, making me think that he may be reminiscing about the days with Roger, just as Rayleigh was seen earlier in this arc. Also of note, we get the in-canon reveal of Shanks' ship's name, the Red Force. We've known about its name for years thanks to data books, but I believe this is the first time it's been referred to in the series proper, as it had never been formally named in any of its prior appearances. Interestingly, amongst the reactions to this news from various Emperor strongholds is Marine HQ. We last saw Sakazuki tuned into Vegapunk's broadcast angrily earlier in this arc, but I don't believe any of the dialogue here is coming from him specifically, but instead from various Marines at the base, reminding us that their priority is to protect the good of the people, not get swept up into the antics of piracy. Sakazuki is shown in the bottom half of the spread beside Dragon, who we've seen throughout the arc as well, but something of note is that there's also a mysterious silhouetted character with a somewhat familiar handguard on their blade. The speculation for this character is rampant, with some believing it to be the Burn Scar Man that we've heard so much about in recent years, and others wanting it to be Hanafuda, the former warlord who lost to Ace that was recently debuted in Volume 109's SBS. Given the shape of the sword, there's even reason to speculate that this is a member of the Figureland family, aside from St. Garling, who was also present in the spread, by the way, last seen in real time earlier in this arc when executing St. Miosgard. Garling is the commander of the Holy Knights, and it would make a lot of sense to see him and his men deployed in an effort to prevent the One Piece from being found by these pirates. The sword wielded by the silhouetted figure somewhat resembles the blade that we see Garling use, but it's also comparable to the one used by Shanks. There have been many theories involving a Shanks twin for years now, so who knows? Maybe it's all as simple as this person being the silhouetted Holy Knight that we saw when Dragon mentioned them earlier in the arc. If you have any fun guesses for who this character may be, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Personally, I'm open to the idea that this could just be any brand new character that we have yet to see. Besides this figure is another silhouetted person, of course being Emu, who we also last saw earlier in the arc, staring into a portrait of what can only be assumed to be Lily. Mirroring them on the other page is interestingly Kobe, who was shown just a few chapters ago recovering from his time on Fololed. The members of SWORD did speak cryptically about the course of action that they were going to take, so perhaps they themselves have some vested interest in the One Piece and the future of that. Kuzan is also present, having last seen him a few chapters ago tuned into the broadcast on Fololed. His inclusion is also quite interesting as it further suggests the idea that he has his own motivation that is separate from helping Blackbeard's piracy. And lastly, Sabo is also here, though I don't necessarily think this is to show him as having his own motivations separate to Dragon and the Revolutionary Army, but rather to reinforce his stake as a pivotal character in the series. The composition of these characters in the spread is quite interesting, as there can be various parallels and speculation to be had. For example, there are some potential takeaways with each character being mirrored here, as there is likely some conflict between Sabo and Sakazuki to be had in the future, but then that would also create a mirror between Kobe and Emu, which is possible but ultimately less likely. There could also be something to be had with characters that are beside one another, such as a potential animosity between Dragon and Akainu, but then again, it's hard to find a direct relationship between Kobe and Garling, for example, amongst other characters. No matter how you cut it, I think the intent is clear that these are going to be some of the more relevant characters as we head into this final saga. This really drives home the point made in Oda's 2023 Jump Fest message, where he alluded to a great battle royale or free-for-all coming in the near future. Now, while only a mere 12 characters were depicted in this spread, I'd be surprised if there weren't even more characters and parties that end up involved. After all, you don't create a world so vast and full of interesting people just to not make use of them. As we saw throughout these chapters, pirates all around the world have once again been reinvigorated to seek out the One Piece, so I'm expecting some more new faces and surprises even as we begin to close out the series. There are still tons of powerful pirates out there that we've barely touched upon, including the remnants of the Rocks pirates, so we'll just have to see what's in store. Now that's about everything I wanted to talk about in this chapter. If there's anything that you want to talk about, please let me know in the comments, as I love reading through everyone's thoughts, especially after a chapter as awesome as this one. If you enjoyed this breakdown or any of the other videos on my channel, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you can get these as soon as they come out. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.